noted 20th century theologian Karl Barth is often cited as having given the following advice to young Christian ministers: preach with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Since I first ran across this quote long ago, I've struggled with it. I've struggled with the philosophical and theological questions it raises regarding the relationship between faith and politics, the church's relationship to the state, the role of a parish minister as it relates to addressing and interpreting for others the religious and moral significance of public policy. Long ago, back in my evangelical Christian days, my initial reaction to Barth's advice was outright abhorrence. This reaction was no doubt shaped by my own experience, having grown up listening to fundamentalist and evangelical Christian preachers use the Bible as a bludgeon to convince their followers that women who had abortions were murderers, that God hated gay people, that Jesus supported supply-side trickle-down economics. I saw pastors of the self-proclaimed religious right preach to their congregations that their Christian faith demanded a specific stand on political issues, and I hated this. It led me to conclude that the church should not be in the business of interpreting the affairs of the world for others through its own biased and narrowly focused religious lens. I came to conclude early on that the church should be a place where politics are checked at the sanctuary door. So I created in my mind this imaginary division between the so-called political and the social. The church, I thought, should focus its outreach on safe, non-controversial social issues, mercy-based ministries we could all agree upon, like feeding the hungry. And we should avoid political thickets where reasonable minds could differ. I came to believe that regarding controversial political questions, the church would do best to keep the peace and remain silent. Nuts to Karl Barth. But over time, I came to realize that this so-called solution was worse than the problem it was seeking to cure. Political decisions are moral and religious decisions. If I truly believe that my religious values have value, and if I want to live an authentic life as an active participant in this world that I am blessed to inhabit, then I cannot be willfully ignorant of this fact. Political questions at their heart often involve matters of ethical and theological significance. Policy decisions are absolutely values-laden decisions. And in a democracy, especially in a democracy, each of us has a moral and religious duty to try and create a world that best expresses the values that we each hold at the core of our beings. And the fact is, we cannot stop the religious right from speaking to these issues, so the religious left must speak as well, lest we give the appearance that we have nothing to say. Silence itself is a form of speech. What we don't say often speaks far louder than what we do say. Bishop Desmond Tutu said it a little stronger. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So maybe Karl Barth was right. Yet my past experience in the conservative Christian church leaves me a little cautious. I recognize the immense power and influence of the pulpit. I worry about ministerial hegemony. And so I want to be intentional about striking a balance when it comes to discussing politics in the pulpit. I want to speak plainly yet passionately about the ways that I believe the values of our faith should be expressed in our public policy. But I also want to leave ample space for each of you to use your faith to come to your own conclusions. Our congregants must feel empowered to dissent from the opinion of the minister and the opinion of the majority of this congregation. But let's start by being very open and honest about who we are. Unitarian Universalism is an unapologetically progressive faith. That means that we hold progressive values like justice, equality, and compassion. As a progressive faith, many of us UUs hold progressive political views, especially on social issues related to historically marginalized and oppressed people, including people of color, the LGBTQ community, women, and the impoverished. The vast majority of our congregants are Democrats, Green Party, or left-leaning independents, and that is nothing to apologize for to anyone. However, let me also be clear that as a faith, we are beholden to no political party. We are not the religious arm of the Democrats. In fact, I would argue that there have been several neoliberal policies championed by the Democratic Party over the past several decades that are very much at odds with the core values of our progressive faith. And that might be the subject of a sermon for another day. And when the timing is right, that is a sermon that I will not be afraid to preach. Why? Because in addition to our cherished progressive values of justice and equality and compassion, we Unitarian Universalists also cherish the value of freedom, intellectual freedom especially, and the right of conscience. And as I mentioned last week, UU theologian James Luther Adams reminds us that an earmark of the free church tradition of which we are a modern manifestation is being intentionally inclusive of dissent. Dissent is the firewall that stops majoritarian positions from becoming sacrosanct orthodoxies. Dissent is a check against fundamentalism, which is a value antithetical to all forms of liberalism, including our own. Openness to dissent is an integral part of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. So you can still be a UU without necessarily agreeing with every single social justice statement passed at General Assembly. Think of it this way. At last count, there's approximately a bajillion Roman Catholics in the world. Now, do you know exactly how many of those bajillion Catholics actually believe every single thing that the church technically requires them to believe? By my count, approximately 5. And the current pope is not one of them. It shouldn't be easier to be an internally dissenting Catholic than an internally dissenting Unitarian Universalist. Dissent is a form of diversity, which we claim to celebrate in this religious community. And so it is important for us to hold space within our midst for reasonable dissent, not incompatible with our shared values. Moreover, I believe this principle is applicable on a macro level as well. I personally have no interest in seeing the United States of America devolve into a one-party state, regardless of which party that might be. That is a recipe for totalitarianism. As a nation, we are strengthened by reasonable diversity of thought and diversity of viewpoint. I believe our system of government would benefit from multiple healthy political parties that can reasonably and rigorously debate and explore important policies while still being able to set aside petty partisanship in order to come together on the most pressing issues we face for the greater good of us all. Now, with all that said, being intentionally inclusive of dissent does not require us to believe that all political views have equal validity, that every political position has equal moral value. Simply stated, there are some views on political issues that are squarely antithetical to the values of our faith. And when those policies rear their head, we must ask ourselves, what is the role of the church? I gravitate toward the answer of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The church is the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club. Now, in heeding the Reverend Dr. King's words, we, the church, must be judicious about when and how we decide to take upon ourselves the mantle of the prophet or the spirit of the watchman. We must not sound a false alarm, yet we must not cry peace when the enemy is at the gate. Which leads us this morning to Mr. Trump. I frankly have given up trying to predict exactly what policies Donald Trump is going to pursue as President of the United States. Less than a month after the election, he has already reversed course on multiple campaign promises. In December, he may reverse course again, and in January, he may reverse again on the reversals of his reversals. But Mr. Trump has already made some alarming decisions that I do believe demand a response from those of us who truly believe in the values of our Unitarian Universalist faith. This morning, I will address only one issue of concern, the one issue that, as I see it, carries with it the most danger for our nation. It started during the campaign when Mr. Trump repeatedly made overtures suggesting that he was not completely abhorred by the idea of tacitly accepting political support from white supremacists. It should have come as no surprise then that Mr. Trump's sympathy, or at least apparent sympathy, toward these white supremacist groups led these groups to offer their frighteningly enthusiastic endorsement of Mr. Trump during the campaign, and also inspired them to celebrate his victory with a vociferation and a brazenness that I have never witnessed surrounding a modern American political candidate. And so it should come as no surprise that following the election, we as a nation have seen a massive surge in hate crimes perpetuated against the usual targets of these white supremacists. I have been watching with hope for signals from Mr. Trump that he would vigorously and unequivocally denounce these white supremacists, including those in the alt-right movement. If you do not know about the alt-right, I recommend that you do some research. In short, they are a group of white nationalists and white supremacists. They are virulently misogynistic, often young, tech-savvy, and well-educated. They take great pride in anti-political correctness, which often assumes the form of intentionally offensive jokes levied against the LGBTQ community and Jews. Now, to his credit, I will say that when pressed by journalists, Mr. Trump and his surrogates have technically denounced the words and actions of these groups, though not with the vigor that would have personally set me at ease. Compounding the issue is Mr. Trump's recent selection of Jeff Sessions to become the next Attorney General of the United States and his appointment of Stephen Bannon to be White House Chief Strategist and Senior Counselor. To put it bluntly, Jeff Sessions and Stephen Bannon are heroes of white supremacists, and especially the alt-right. Why is that? In 1986, while Jeff Sessions was under consideration for appointment to a federal bench, testimony was delivered that he repeatedly called a black lawyer boy, warned him to be careful of how he talked to white folks, had no problem using the N-word. He did not deny calling the NAACP and MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, quote, un-American organizations teaching anti-American values. He's on record calling the Voting Rights Act a piece of intrusive legislation, and he allegedly called a white civil rights lawyer a disgrace to his race. The testimony against Sessions was enough to convince Senate Republicans in 1986 not to confirm him to the federal bench. Since that time, as a senator, he has supported policies that led the Southern Poverty Law Center to declare him a champion of anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant extremists. Stephen K. Bannon oversaw the transformation of Breitbart News into what he himself declared the platform for the alt-right. Bannon himself has been accused of making anti-Semitic remarks, and he is on record making unabashedly derogatory remarks against women. When directly asked whether he would consider himself to be a white nationalist, Bannon demurred and parried by claiming instead to be an economic nationalist. And yet, just last year, Bannon was on the radio expressing his concern that there are currently too many CEOs in Silicon Valley of South Asian descent. And that concern was followed immediately by these words: "A country is more than an economy. We're a civic society." Bannon, as former editor-in-chief of Breitbart News, is either a member of the alt-right white nationalists or, at the very least, intentionally exacerbated and exploited white nationalist sentiment among the alt-right in order to turn a profit. Mr. Trump's campaign, which included vehement anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric, which included a tweet of Hillary Clinton's face beside a Star of David superimposed over a pile of cash, which included a refusal to immediately denounce former imperial wizard of the KKK, David Duke. Mr. Trump's campaign, along with his relatively tepid denunciations against the alt-right and other hate groups, alongside his proposed appointments of Jeff Sessions and Steve Bannon, are sending dangerously mixed signals. I am gravely concerned that Mr. Trump's meteoric rise is both a symptom and a cause of a resurgent racism in this country. Across the country, KKK chapters increased by over 250% last year. Over that same time, anti-Semitic chatter online has more than doubled. And more hate crimes have now been committed following Donald Trump's election victory than we saw following 9/11. If our faith means anything, if it stands for anything, it stands against white supremacy. It stands against hatred and acts of terror against the marginalized. And this is exactly the type of politics that must be spoken of in our churches. We people of faith must come together and resist the normalization, the mainstreaming of white nationalism and white supremacy in this country. To that end, I would ask you, if you have not already done so, consider making a phone call or sending a letter to our U.S. senators, asking them to oppose the appointments of Jeff Sessions and Steve Bannon to Mr. Trump's cabinet. Moreover, consider sending a direct communication to Mr. Trump himself to tell him that his words, his actions, and his inactions are enabling and empowering white terrorists. It's not much, but it is a first step. The harder work is still yet to come. A glimpse of that work is revealed in an illuminating editorial that appeared in the New York Times yesterday, written by R. Derek Black, himself a former white nationalist. I will post a link to our church's Facebook page. Please take the time to read it. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that we must remain vigilant. And I know that saying nothing, doing nothing, simply sitting tight and hoping for the best is not an option. In Dante's Inferno, the most terribly afflicted souls, the lowest of the low, were reserved a special place of torment just outside of hell. These were the souls who in life remained neutral during a time of great moral decision. Virgil tells Dante that these souls, because they refused to choose a side, were therefore repugnant to both God and the devil, and were fit neither for heaven nor for hell. And so they were doomed for all eternity to mourn the utter moral insignificance of their earthly lives. We are facing a time of great moral decision in this country. But the sides are not Trump versus Clinton, nor Republican versus Democrat, not even liberal versus conservative. Ultimately, it is love versus fear. We can either choose to be a people who love boldly and courageously, who embrace all people regardless of race and creed, who dedicate our lives to the pursuit of justice and equality for all. Or we can choose to be a people who are scared that there will never be enough for all of us, who fear the destruction of a particular way of life, who dedicate our lives to building and defending walls that separate us from one another. If our choice is love, then we must have the courage to take bold action and speak bold words. We must have the temerity to bear witness against hatred with clear language. We must be prepared to show and lead the way by living lives dedicated to justice, equality, and compassion. Blessed be.